This topic is a little challenging, and I'll tell you why. One, because we have about an hour to discuss this, and usually I've seen that even a couple of days might be a little short for something like this. The other reason for the challenge is that delegation and empowerment as concepts have been used so much, or rather overused in organizations, that there are different perceptions of both of these management tools which are floating around. And therefore, it's going to be challenging but exciting to try and demystify some of those, and I hope I'm able to do that. So let's see. What I will be doing, and this is for the viewers, what I will be doing is from time to time, I'll be sharing some slides with you. By and large, I'll prefer to just talk, but wherever I feel it's important to share slides, I will do that. Please hold on to your questions. Would love to address those as best as I can at the end of the session. So I'm just going to open my slide so you know what we are going to be covering, and then I will quickly exit out of that. The way I had organized this session was I thought in the first part, we could cover what are some of the obstacles to delegation and empowerment happening within organizations. And having done that, also look at why delegation and empowerment are so important from a leadership perspective. In the second part of the discussion today, I will explore the concept of both delegation and empowerment at a slightly deeper level. We'll also talk about what are the crucial differences between the two. And I think that's going to be interesting, at least I hope so, for the audience. Eventually, I'd like to look at some of the considerations while delegating and empowering. So, there are some thoughts that I should be able to leave with the viewers in terms of what could be done or not done, as the case might be. So I'm going to take 4 contexts to do this first part of the session. So with respect to empowerment and delegation, I'm going to talk about the historical context, the organizational context, individual context, as well as the cultural context. Let's start with historical context first. And I think we can dispense with the slides for the moment. Okay, so historically, if you look at it, and I'm talking about many years ago, what was happening? Information was concentrated in a few hands. So at the top of the leadership chain, you had most of the information being focused or concentrated there. And then the leaders at the top would decide how much of this information they wanted to share with people, below the line. And people below the line would then take a similar call on whom to share that information with and how much to share it. So where did the power come from for the leader? The power came from having possession of that information, which was to a large extent exclusive at a certain level. Because people at the bottom or at the center didn't have access to that information, they would therefore logically look up to their leadership to give them that vital information. So that's the first challenge that was there. Information was concentrated at the top and power came from holding that information. The second part historically was differential competence. Now, what do I mean by that? So again, historically, people at the top were the first recipients of any kind of competence development that would happen. So the thought was, if you're here, most of the budgets and most of the focus around developing competence needs to be centered here. And then by the time it would peter down to the other levels, those budgets would keep on getting constrained. Now, because people at the top, your leadership teams really, were the most competent by design, if I may say so, people who were less competent because they hadn't probably got the opportunity to build their competence would again logically look up to their leaders for any kind of inputs. And those inputs then came in the form of directional input, right? So we had a situation where both information and differential competence were concentrated in the upper echelons within the organizational hierarchy. And these people would then decide how much to share, with whom to share, when to share. Okay, so this is the historical context. Now, how has this changed for leaders today and also for the followers? So if you look at it, information has got democratized, right? So information is largely freely available. There is a lot more transparency. To the extent that some of this information might not necessarily be required from the organization and might be more generic, people have more tools at their disposal to get that information. Okay, so that's the first paradigm shift, that the information is no longer concentrated, it's democratized. Let's look at the other challenge that we spoke about, differential competence. So today, with the opening up of MOOC platforms, so think Coursera, think edX, Udemy, Udacity, those kind of platforms. Also, a lot of social learning platforms. As a resource, I'm no longer dependent on my organization or on my leadership to decide for me what courses I need to take, what are the kind of competency development that I need to do for myself. So I could very well decide where is it or which are the areas that I need to build competence on. And having decided that, I have pretty reasonably priced tools, and in a lot of cases, free tools available at my disposal to build my competence. So suddenly, the two factors which were really working in favor of leaders historically, which is information concentration and differential competence, both of these were snatched away from the leaders. So today, a leader actually has to think beyond that, and they have to look at more compelling and more innovative ways of trying to engage with their followers and to have their respect as well as their trust. Okay, so this was the historical context. We spoke about cultural context as well in the introduction. That's the other part that I think it's important to understand when we get into understanding what are the hindrances to delegation and empowerment. So look at culture. Now, people define culture in different ways. To me, culture is pretty simple. Culture is what gives you the sense of the kind of values or norms within an organization. So, for instance, if an organization values order, right, or if it values stability, then what is going to be happening in the organization is that there'll be more focus on processes, operations, and so on. So what's going to happen? Conformance is going to become more important than innovation or creativity, because the culture is actually defining that. The culture is saying we value order, we value stability, and therefore everything is centered around that. So any experimentation goes against that culture, right? The same thing happens if you're operating in a control-centric culture. In a control-centric culture, what's happening? There is a greater likelihood that the leaders within that organization will want to gain control, and having gained that control, they would then want to keep retaining that control, right? So culture also could be a hindrance or could be an asset to delegation and empowerment happening or not happening. Now, this is where I might want to show you a fantastic model that I usually share with a lot of my clients. I think you will find a lot of value in this. So let's look at it. So if you can see the board, you'll find that there are 4 different kind of cultures which are available to the organization, right? So on the top right-hand side, you have what we call a control-centric culture. What's happening in a control-centric culture? The overriding theme within this kind of a cultural organization is that we succeed by gaining and retaining control, okay? Now, if we are talking about gaining and keeping control, where is the leadership focus? The leadership focus, therefore, is on maintaining power. It's on being authoritarian, it's on being directive, right? So you'll see a lot more direction happening here than delegation or empowerment. And that's how the culture is actually driving this piece, right? On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have what we call the cultivation culture. Now, cultivation is really looking at what? It's looking at nurturing employees, right? And therefore, the overriding theme is that we'd like to succeed by growing people, nurturing them, and why? In line of them being able to follow or adopting our vision. So the probability of empowerment happening in a cultivation culture is way more than the same thing happening in a control culture. In fact, in control cultures, empowerment is generally exceedingly low. Whereas in a cultivation culture, you cannot be existing without empowerment really happening there, right? So the focus in a cultivation culture from a leadership perspective is of being an enabler, being a catalyst, and empowering your team members. The third kind of a cultural construct that could come up is what we call competence, which is essentially where craftsmanship is practiced. And the theme there is that you succeed by being the best in your domain. Okay. Where is the leadership focus in a competence culture? It's on setting standards. It's on being a taskmaster. So again, it's a little directional, right? It's more achievement oriented. Therefore, leadership may not have the appetite to invest time in nurturing or in enabling. And therefore, in competence, while the degree of control is not as high as say, in a control culture, but neither is the level of empowerment as high as it would be in the cultivation culture. Finally, you have what we call the collaboration culture, and no prizes for guessing, where that is coming from. So in a collaboration culture, the theme is that you succeed by doing things together, collaboratively. Leadership focus, as is obvious, would be in the leader trying to build teams, right? Coaching becomes a very important part of this. So how do I coach? How do I train? How do I orient my entire team or my business to collaboratively work together in one direction? If you take a pause here and you look at it, think about this as a question. Where do you think maximum empowerment would be happening in all these four cultures? Cultivation and collaboration. Because in cultivation and collaboration, that is exactly where, you're either being a catalyst, you're being an enabler, or, you're coaching people to actually perform at a very different level. Least amount of empowerment would happen in a control culture, followed closely by the competence culture. So we can dispense with the slide for some time. I'm hoping this made sense. By the way, this is known as the Schneider model, a very popular model. In fact, I use this a lot, even in my agile classes, when we are talking about which cultures, are supportive of agile practices. And even there, you have the collaborative and the cultivation culture, which really work a lot in favor of agile. Let's look at, so we've done the historical context where we spoke about information and differential competence, hindering empowerment and delegation. We just spoke about how culture has an impact on delegation and empowerment. The third context is what we call the organizational context. Now, what could this be? If you look at organizations, think about it. You could have decentralized structures, you could have centralized ones. Where do you think empowerment is going to be more? Where do you think delegation is going to happen more? Obviously, in decentralized structures. So depending on the size, location, distribution of your organization across territories, the more decentralized it is, I've noticed the higher the delegation and at times the empowerment as well. The other thing from an organization's perspective, which impacts delegation or empowerment, is how is communication shared across the organization? How is the coordination? Less the coordination, less the communication, lower the delegation. The third thing would be lack of established practices. So if the procedures and methods within the organization for different tasks are not very established, delegation will not happen. What would promote empowerment, though, is the unstable, non-repetitive nature of the work. Now, this is interesting. Think about it. In your organization, if the work or the nature of the work is unstable or it's non-repetitive, are you going to be able to delegate? The less repetitive the work, the lower the chances of delegating. But the interesting thing here is, in a lot of organizations, while they may not be able to delegate in such a scenario, empowerment actually helps. And this delegation and empowerment as two very disparate management tools that leaders could use. Okay, so that's your organizational context. The final context, when it comes to hindrances to delegation and empowerment, is what is largely talked about in organizations, and that is the individual context. How does the leader, as an individual, either hinder or support delegation and empowerment. Now, most leaders crave control, and I'm sorry that sounds harsh, but the fact is that we've been conditioned to believe that as a leader you need to be in control, right? Because typically the accountabilities on most things are there with the leadership. But the question is, why is it that leaders crave control? It starts from conditioning. So I come from Gen X. Gen X, I'm guessing, would be mid 40s to mid 50s, right? Most people from a Gen X category, or the baby boomers category, we've grown up with the conditioning that there is a leader. You need to look up to the leader. The leader knows best, and therefore a lot of what the leader says, is to be absorbed and then do it. So essentially, execute what the leader is asking you to do. Now, in that context, the leader could be directive, or the leader could be delegative, but certainly not empowering. Because empowering would mean that I am thinking on my own, taking my own decisions, have a great deal of autonomy, and I'm accountable for everything that I'm doing, right? So we have been conditioned to think in a particular way. As a leader, therefore, we behave with our followers in a certain way, and as followers, we look up to our leaders in a different way. But when you look at Gen Y or the millennials, now they're a different breed altogether. And if you look at Gen Z, which is your 25 years and below, the paradigm for them is entirely different, which means there is a lot more questioning happening. So try getting work done from a Gen Z resource without bringing them into what they're supposed to do, without getting ownership out there. And you realize what I'm saying. I mean, it's so difficult to get stuff done there. So the kind of people that you're dealing with also to a large extent impacts the kind of strategy that you would use as a leader. With Gen Z, things would be very complicated if you were not empowering them. So all the disadvantages of lack of empowerment would actually reflect there. But going back to our individual leaders, what are some of the things which keep them from giving up control? Conditioning, of course, was one of those. The other thing is insecurity, the fear that if I were to give too much authority, stuff done, whatever needs to be done. Anxiety and stress around that, and of course, lack of confidence in other people's abilities. So there could be a lot of other reasons. But all of these contribute to the individual, the leader, being hindered when it comes to delegating or empowering. So in the historical context, we've taken the cultural context, the organizational, as well as the individual context when it comes to hindrances to delegation and empowerment. Let's take a quick look at this so that it settles in. And I'm guessing there will be questions around whatever we've discussed so far. So do feel free to ask me those questions later on. So these were the four. Historical context was all about information being concentrated with a few hands. Differential competence, we saw how that could hinder empowerment and delegation. Cultural context, we spoke about control cultures versus cultivation or collaborative cultures, and how control cultures also inhibit delegation and empowerment. We spoke about the organizational and the individual context just now. That was fairly clear. Okay. We can move out of the slide share now. The second part that I wanted to discuss with you is, why is delegation and empowerment so intrinsic to what a leader does? Now, on the surface, it's actually pretty self-explanatory, right? Think for a moment. If I were a leader whose entire leadership was based, or my entire leadership credibility was based around position, authority, and power, that would be a very tenuous situation. Why would it be tenuous? because the moment you took away either power, position, or authority away from me, I would, in a sense, have nothing to offer to any of my team members. So leaders who operate only from a position of power, position, or authority tend to be perceived as tepid and ineffectual leaders, and not just by their own team members, but also by their that kind of a perception that can be fairly damaging, not just to the leadership, but to the entire business. Okay.
Mr. Jagmohan, I believe we lost you. So I believe we lost Mr. Jagmohan. We'll have him reconnect. I believe he has rejoined us.
Yeah, he's back.
Yeah, Mr. Jagmohan.
Sorry about that, Peter.
Yeah,
I
yes,
think there
yeah.
might have been a power outage here. My apologies to everybody. I don't know at what point I dropped off, but I think I might have been speaking about that if a leader is not really empowering the team, on the one hand, they are not developing themselves into a strategic resource because their entire time and bandwidth is being spent on transactional items which could have been handled by the team members. But on the other hand, the team and the team members are also not developing because they're not getting an opportunity to learn more because the leader really isn't empowering them or delegating to them. At the end of the day, the leader, the individuals, the team, and the organization, all these constituents suffer, and they suffer because the leader is really not being able to devolve control beyond him or herself, right? At this stage, I'd like to quickly take you back to the slide. The idea is to share with you the core leadership deliverables, as I like to call them. And they're actually quite simple. So as a leader, what is it that I really need to do? The task is of paramount importance, getting the task done. But how do I get the task done is important, because I could do this alone or I could do this collaboratively with my team and other stakeholders. So am I just focusing on the task, or is my leadership characteristic also considering how I'm developing all the individuals within my team while getting the task done becomes the other part of my leadership? And of course, the third one is getting the task done, developing my leaders, but at the same time, ensuring that the entire team is moving towards being what we call self-directed teams or high-performing teams, right? And eventually looking at the organizational context, which is how strategically oriented am I? Therefore, what kind of strategic outlook do I bring to the organization, right? What kind of innovation am I bringing to the organization through my leadership and through my team? What kind of a culture or mini culture am I creating as part of my leadership? So these are all the core drivers that I would want to be on top of as a leader. And if, as you could see, if I am not empowering, I'll probably get the task done, but the individuals are not going to get developed. The team is not going to be self-directed. Organizational deliverables are going to falter over a period of time. And eventually, even my ability to get the task done comes down because my strategic capability is not really going up. Because at this stage, quick recap, we've spoken about the hindrances to delegation and empowerment, where we spoke about those four contexts. We've spoken about why delegation and empowerment are important from a leadership perspective. The third piece that I want to do with you is to explore, let me shut this. The third piece that I want to do is share with you, or rather explore with you, what is delegation, what is empowerment, and go down to a slightly deeper level and see how these two tools engage with each other. So quick question for people over there, and you can try and give me a response in the chat. In your mind, how is delegation and empowerment different, or is it different at all? Okay, I'm waiting for some responses. So Gaurang says delegation is without giving authority. Okay. And then Meenal is saying delegation and power are different. Gaurang is now saying empowerment is with authority. Okay. Anybody else? Delegation is just assigning a task, Radha says from Hyderabad. Okay. Okay, great. So first and foremost, a lot of people at leadership levels also end up using these two terms interchangeably. But as we know, that may not really be the case. So delegation at a very, very simple level is when I assign a task to someone. Okay. The act of assigning a task to someone and wanting them to do it is delegation. Now, to the extent that they need to get the task done, I might even give them the authority to do that, but only to the extent that is necessary to get that task done. So I am making them responsible for that task, but the accountability for that task is still with me as the leader. I am accountable. When I am doing empowerment, what is happening is that I am giving, of course, the task to somebody, but I am not giving too many instructions around the task. So even in delegation, by the way, the leader would provide very specific instructions on what needs to be done, might also tell them how to do it, which goes against the popularly held belief of delegation. But in classical delegation, the leader would tell you what to do, would give you specific instructions, would have frequent feedback sessions with you, would review your progress as well. You would have the authority only to the limit of what you're supposed to do. In empowerment, I'm not going to get into details with you. I will use broad strokes to give you a gist of what I want you to do. With those broad strokes, I will also give you the authority to do it. You will not just have the responsibility, you will also have the accountability for getting this done. You will be taking decisions on your own and not necessarily having to consult me on that task. You are very high on autonomy as well. So whether it's decision-making, autonomy, accountability, all of those things happen in empowerment, may not happen when we are talking about delegation. So that's the primary difference there. Of course, there is a lot more, but I'm guessing there'll also be a lot of questions around that, and I'd like to kind of pick that up when we are getting into the questioning sessions. Just doing a time check. Okay, we have some more time. I think this is where we could look at how the leadership continuum looks like. This should address some of the questions which might be there in your mind. We call this the Tannenbaum-Schmidt leadership continuum. So if you look at it, as you move towards the right-hand side on the x-axis, what is happening? The leader is actually giving up more and more control. By the time you reach the 7th level, the leader has actually abdicated all control. In conjunction with this, the subordinate's area of freedom, or your team member's freedom, is actually what's happening to the subordinate's freedom. The subordinate's freedom goes up as the leader relinquishes control. Now, the question that you might want to think of, or you might want to ask me later, is if this were so simple, that you can actually move to delegation and abdication, which could be taken as a surrogate for empowerment. If it were that simple to do this, why is it that we don't see leaders doing it? Why is it that we don't see team members and subordinates getting that kind of freedom to actually think for themselves, take decisions on their own? Is a question you might want to put up, and I'd be glad to answer that. But here are some leadership styles that leaders could use. Now, I might also want to tell you here at this stage that while we're talking about delegation and empowerment, it does not mean that the other leadership styles, which is telling, selling, suggestion, consulting, joining, that these are bad. These styles are good or bad depending on the situation and the kind of person that you're dealing with, right? And the kind of culture or the cultural ecosystem in which you're operating. But I thought I'll leave this continuum with you. So just in case you have questions around this, you should be able to ask me those questions later on. Okay, this takes me to the final stage, which is what are some of the considerations that I would recommend while trying to delegate or empower individuals. The first is competence. And we can actually knock this off. We don't need the slide for this, I remember it. Competence and commitment are very important when you're looking at delegating or empowering. I have seen a lot of leaders, and some of these leaders are CXOs. I have seen a lot of leaders making the mistake, unwittingly, of delegating to people who may not have the competence or commitment. So just because a person happens to be at a senior level, or because I have a certain perception of that person, could be subjective, unless I have validated that the competence and the commitment exists within that person, to delegate or empower such an individual would be potential harakiri or suicide. So one of the first things I want to do when I'm looking at delegating is to ensure that the competence and commitment has been validated. How do you validate competence? Competent is nothing but the knowledge and skills. It's easy to do that. You could do it through observation on the job. You could, you could look at giving opportunities to people, see how they respond to those opportunities, how well they do, where they're faltering. So all of those are different ways of trying to figure out competence, and likewise commitment as well. Commitment is the willingness, right, to do stuff. It also reflects your enthusiasm, your motivation, your confidence for whatever task you're supposed to do. So validating competence and commitment becomes very important while delegating or empowering. The next is trustworthiness. Look, if I'm the leader and I have to empower someone to do something, and I'm making them accountable for that, I need to be able to trust them. Now, trust is both ways. I could be a leader who may not trust somebody despite them being trustworthy, in which case I need to look inwards and ask myself, what is stopping me from, trusting the other person? But the other thing could also be true. I'm willing to trust, but what if the person is not trustworthy? So either they have not demonstrated commitment in the past, or I find they don't have the requisite competence. Then I cannot trust them to delegate to them, let alone empowering them, right? The other thing that I normally see leaders looking at in people before empowering them is what is those people's commitment to their self-development. So how committed are those people to continuously learn and evolve from all the sources that are available to them, right? You remember we started this discussion by saying that information has got democratized. Differential competence doesn't exist because now people have platforms through which they can add to their competence. But then they have to do that. As a leader, I would want to see within my team, are people committed to their self-development? If they are, then they are potentially great candidates that I might want to look at either delegating to or empowering. The other thing that I've noticed a lot of leaders do when they look at empowerment or delegation is they look for healthy curiosity within their team members. Healthy curiosity, willingness to experiment. So healthy curiosity is the person, curious enough to ask more questions, not necessarily to me, but within himself or herself. Is the person given to introspection? Does the person talk to other stakeholders and try and figure out what's happening or what could potentially happen? That's healthy curiosity. The other part is willingness to experiment. So not just asking questions, but also having the courage to look for answers, even if it means experimenting to try and figure out some answers which may not be known to anyone, including the leader. Leaders love these kind of people. And I think it's essential that leaders consciously look for these kind of people, because unless you have those kind of people, who are you going to delegate to? Who are you going to empower, right? The other thing is, within my team, do I have paradigm shifters or do I have followers? If it's a team where everybody is just going to follow the paradigm blindly, then this team is headed for sudden death. And if there are a lot of these teams within the organization is headed towards sudden death. So as a leader, what you might want to look at is, who are the potential paradigm shifters within your business or within your team? These are the people that need nurturing. These are the people that you want to actually, set them free to be able to think for themselves, take decisions. Of course, you will do this gradually, because doing this all of a sudden is again potential suicide. So observation, validation, and then, going for that. Now, these are things that you're looking for in your team, but what is it that you're looking at as far as you as a leader are concerned? One is balancing the leadership deliverables. Remember, we spoke about getting the task done, the individual focus, team focus, and the organizational focus. So balancing all of those deliverables. Now, how are you going to do that? Coaching becomes very important. Now, one of the areas where I feel some of the leaders can really do a much more better job is in taking time out to coach their team members. Because unless you coach them, how are you going to raise their competence levels? How is their commitment level going to go up, right? And if that doesn't go up, you cannot delegate, you cannot empower. So it becomes a vicious circle in that sense, and you'll never be able to delegate. Now, a lot of leaders say that we don't have the time to spend coaching people. The question I like to pose to them is, why is it that you do not have the time? Because you do not have the time because you're doing stuff which ideally some of your team members could have done, but because they have not been coached, they cannot do that. So you are still focused on transactional items. So again, it's a vicious cycle. Okay. Self-awareness and self-regulation, I think for any leader, very critical. So I could be control-centric, but am I aware that I crave control? Because being aware that I crave control in itself is the beginning of relinquishing control. But what if I'm not even aware of that? What if I have not set up feedback processes within my organization or my team for people to come and tell me upfront, you crave control. We'd like you to relinquish some of that to us. So self-awareness, important. Even more important, self-regulation. What do I mean by that? So, okay, I have analyzed that as a personality, I crave control, but what am I doing about it? Am I able to regulate it? Am I able to manage it when it requires to be managed? If not, not only am I failing at my leadership role, I am setting the wrong precedent for my team members to follow, because a lot of them are going to fashion their own leadership styles around what they see me doing or not doing. Okay, so self-awareness and self-regulation. The other is leadership culture. Now, I understand that a lot of times as leaders, we may not have the ability to change organizational culture. That takes months, at times years, to change. So what if I'm caught in a control culture? We spoke about those four cultural constructs: control, competence, collaboration, and cultivation. So what if I'm caught up in a control culture and I say, well, in my organization, the overriding theme is success by gaining and retaining control. So how do I end up empowering people? Now, you may not have control over the organizational culture, but you certainly have control over the culture that you set within your business or your team. And that's the leadership culture that you set. So questioning ourselves, what is the leadership culture that I'm really setting within my business, could be another essential consideration in the path towards effective delegation, effective empowerment, and eventually, look, if you found the right people, if you've empowered them, then we need to get out of the way. Get out of the way and let them do what they're empowered to do, and then hold them accountable for that. And that's really the leadership challenge. The leadership challenge is not delegation. The leadership challenge is empowerment, and after empowerment, letting them be by getting out of their way, right? And only keeping them accountable to what they were supposed to do. I think, in short, if we can do some of these things, delegation and empowerment both can be achieved well. Delegation, again, as you would have probably figured out earlier and certainly now, delegation is much easier. It's a very simple task of just attributing a task to someone. Empowerment is the real challenge. Creating a bunch of people in your team, in your company, who can think for themselves, who have the ability to do things themselves, who can be autonomous without being uncomfortable, who can speak up, and who can take up accountability, which means huge ownership. That is the leadership challenge. And if we can kind of do that, I think we're onto a good path. And as the topic said, you certainly don't need to be a leader who walks alone, because you will have a mile of followers who will be willing to do just about anything for you and the organization. And that's really what is the best outcome that any leader can expect. I was given 45 minutes to have my say. 45 minutes are over. I'm open to questions. Please feel free to throw them at me. I may not be able to answer all of them, but whatever I can, to the best of my abilities, I'd be more than happy to do so. Okay, I have a few questions which have. Peter, thank you so much. I see these questions. So it might be difficult for me to scroll up.
Yeah, so do you want me to take them for you?
No, so I'm just looking at the questions that you sent me on WhatsApp. So I'll just kind of address those.
Sure, sir.
So one question is,